I'm an intensive care doctor in a district general hospital, and I'm very proud of being a district general hospital consultant. Being an intensivist, I see this problem of sepsis every day of my working life. And let me assure you, it is big. Not the first time I encountered sepsis, but early in my consultant career, I met Jem, and Jem was dying on my intensive care unit, and it was very clear he was dying. It was also very clear that he'd been let down by our healthcare system. GPs had seen him, paramedics had seen him, he'd eventually, after 48 hours, managed to get to hospital, and there, my hospital failed him. We didn't treat his life-threatening sepsis arising due to a relatively straightforward skin and soft tissue infection. It was walking down the hospital corridor following Karen, Jem's now widow, knowing I was about to take this young woman into the relatives interview room and tell her that her fit, strong husband wasn't going to come home, and knowing that she was going to have to go home and tell Tom and Emily that Daddy wasn't coming home, and realising that this was from a condition from which he need not have died, and realising further that Karen would never have heard of the word sepsis, despite the fact it was my clinical bread and butter, that I resolved to do something about this. And sepsis is definitely big. We're at Leeds United, we're at Elland Road. This is Villa Park, former competitors. This is an old photograph. You'll know that because the stadium's full. But at capacity, Villa Park holds more than 40,000 people. And the Holt End stand at the top there holds about 9,500 people, which is slightly fewer people than die from breast cancer every year in the UK. The Doug Ellis stand holds about 14,000 people, which is slightly more than the number of people that die from bowel cancer every year in the UK. Sepsis right now, we conservatively estimate to be claiming 44,000 lives every year, which is more than breast cancer and bowel cancer and prostate cancer and road traffic accidents and HIV and AIDS put together. Whichever way you cut it, this is big. If we don't have antibiotics, sepsis won't claim 44,000 lives in the UK every year. It will claim more like 260,000 lives every year in the UK. And our population will begin to diminish as a result, as will the world population. Because globally, I'll come on to in a moment, these are the data for the UK. 142,000 episodes. But you will note that partly because we're recording it better and partly because incidence genuinely seems to be increasing, that sepsis over the last few years in the UK and in other countries has been increasing in incidence by around 11.5% every year. So if we extrapolate to this year, we expect to see 186,000 cases in the UK, somewhere around 230,000 across the UK. Those are English figures. But these are an underestimate, because these are reliant upon what we write in the notes. And we know that the vast majority of cases of sepsis are never coded as sepsis, because if you write, or a doctor writes, or whomever writes, query sepsis, possible sepsis in the notes, that's never coded as sepsis until someone writes triangle sepsis, or this is sepsis, or diagnosis sepsis. So these are underestimates. Globally, 18 million people develop sepsis every year. 6 million of them die. Of those 6 million, the majority, frighteningly, are children. And the majority are children under 5. And the majority of those are in low and middle income countries. 18 million people dying because we don't have antibiotics, of whom 14 million every year are children. You can quite easily see, if we run out of antibiotics, there will be a race between that and global warming as to what wipes out our species first. There's a bigger, more immediate burden, which is the fiscal burden of sepsis. This was independent work from the York Health Economics Consortium that we commissioned, and it found that the direct costs of sepsis to the NHS were huge, as high as £2.8 billion. This is a press release, so you never put the lower end in. £2.8 billion, but at least £1.5 billion. The burden to the economy might be as high as £15.6 billion. Why? Why that chasm of difference? It's because we save someone from sepsis, we throw them out of hospital, they don't go back to their normal life. They suffer a burden of survival. And this is one of several scientific slides I could have put up. 16.8% incidence of cognitive dysfunction that's moderate or severe at 17 months after surviving sepsis. What does that mean? Well, it means that we as a charity deal with people who can't go back to work. And if they can, it's at a lower level of function than previously. You couple this with another slide I could have put up on post-traumatic stress disorder in 22% of survivors, and you can start to understand how people's finances become challenged, people's relationships become challenged, people's self-worth disappears if we get the recognition of sepsis wrong. A couple of survivors here. Lily, her story. Took her 9 months to be able to care independently for her family after surviving sepsis. She had physical sequelae in addition to the grief following her miscarriage. Fern. 3 years ago, Fern rode a cycle from John O'Groats to Land's End for charity. Today, or a couple of weeks ago when we spoke, 11 months following her sepsis, she can't ride 1 mile. Sepsis affects people's lives physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And I'd like you to join me on a leap of faith. This was a study across a North America chain of hospitals, 11 hospitals, and they did what we do in the UK. They said, in the emergency department, you're going to do the basics. Let's call it the Sepsis 6. In intensive care, you can do all the sexy stuff with central venous catheters and so forth. And in the middle, we're going to have an interface where one calls the other. But they found that getting the basics right rendered the patients ineligible, meaning they didn't need intensive care and didn't need the central venous catheters and all that jazz. So the leap of faith I'd like you to join me on is the stuff we already knew, doing the basics saves lives, the stuff this told us, which is doing the basics prevents intensive care admission, and the stuff that we might imagine and assume, which is that getting the basics right prevents intensive care admission, saves lives, and improves the quality of life for those fortunate enough to survive. We've had some recent changes in definitions, and I just need to take you through those because that's important from an AMR perspective. We used to think this happened, and we looked at cohort mortalities, and we thought, well, yeah, it's okay to get an infection. That's probably relatively benign. If you've got septic shock, your life quite literally hangs in the balance. We then had this chap, Anand Kumar from Canada, who told us that for every hour we delay in administering antimicrobials, the risk of death goes up by 7.6%, which was frightening. So we can start to understand, because we had this, because we didn't want to progress to septic shock, and because, frankly, the definitions to diagnose severe sepsis and septic shock were unworkable at the bedside, I can understand why we started to see care pathways coming in where people were treating patients with uncomplicated sepsis, SIRS plus infection. We had no evidence that these people even needed oral antibiotics, let alone pip-taz, meropenem, and so forth. So we were alarmed. So a number of groups set out to determine the badness, to coin a Mervyn Singer term. The badness that denotes which cohorts of patients need to be treated. Need to phone 999 if you're a GP, need to be transported to hospital if you're a paramedic, or need the Sepsis 6 if you're a hospital health worker. We hit the ground running, and in September 2015, we issued Red Flag Sepsis to try to address this potential minefield of problems with the rapid administration of antimicrobials for people who didn't need them. So red flags were taken from the existing National Early Warning Score, together with a couple of things from the international definitions we could measure at the bedside, and they were intended to empower junior frontline staff to give antibiotics to people who all the Royal Colleges and NHS England agreed were likely to represent a sicker cohort. We then had the aforementioned Mervyn Singer, Professor at Imperial College London and Chair of the International Consensus Definitions Task Force. And let's be honest, there were 3 really good things about the new sepsis definition, which came out earlier this year. Firstly, the narrative. Sepsis is now organ dysfunction. So it's a life-threatening condition arising when a dysregulated host response to infection causes organ dysfunction. Great. We no longer have this slightly woolly pot of sepsis as it used to be, who might be a little bit unwell with tonsillitis, but certainly didn't need pip-taz. The second is the official definition is now a change in the SOFA score. Now, I'm an intensivist. I've been a consultant for 15 years. I've never measured a SOFA score. It's a tool for academics and researchers. No one at the bedside is ever going to measure a SOFA score. But the official definition for academia and for research is fine. And the third thing was we've lost this systemic inflammatory response syndrome thing from the definition of sepsis. It's still an entity that's relevant in infection, but it's not part of the definition. They introduced this thing, which I'll gloss over quickly because it's now gone, but some of you might have heard of QSOFA or Quick SOFA, which they intended as a bedside tool to test. And it was vaguely evidence-based. They looked retrospectively at a large data set, did a slightly fudged version of a regression analysis, and they came out with these three things. And they said if you've got two of those, it was a marker of badness and you might want to look for sepsis. So it was never a diagnosis, but it was a bedside tool. But we were alarmed because the blood pressure and the tachypnea didn't fit with the news criteria. And what we thought is that you can't ask an HCA to measure observations, to calculate a news score using one set of thresholds, and then for a population or a cohort of patients who he or she wasn't qualified to suspect sepsis and pick up another set of thresholds in order to trigger a response. But the good news was for us is that QSOFA has now been shown to be less reliable than the National Early Warning Score and modified early warning scores at identifying badness in infection. There's some unpublished data from us that we'll give you for free, 21,000. We've now got over 40,000 patients in this database, and it does seem that in the context of infection, news predicts bad outcome, and if we add lactate, a very non-specific biomarker, into this, it becomes really quite good at predicting outcome. NICE were the third group to this table, and they produced a guideline, and they had all the new international definitions, they had the red flag stuff, and they chose to slightly tweak red flag sepsis. So that was fine. What that allowed us to do was to work with all of the Royal Colleges, to work with NHS England and various other stakeholders, and present some solutions. And we came up with a lot of tools. And we've got tools for adults who are pregnant, for children, and so forth, across all clinical environments. And we start with the screening prompt. Could this be sepsis? I'm worried. The relative or carer's worried, or the patient just looks unwell, or there's a national early warning score triggering. So that's the screening prompt. That's what makes us think sepsis. We qualify it. Is there reasonable clinical suspicion of an infection? Yes. Then we look for a red flag, and that's what then empowers us to get on and start delivering the Sepsis 6. Now, what NICE recognised was that it wasn't the case that you had a heart rate of 131 and you needed blue lights and rushing to hospital, or you had a heart rate of 129 and you were fine and take some paracetamol. So they wanted to put in a safety net, and they did that with amber flags, which is a slight mishmash of physiological criteria and risk factors. And just like red flags, there's no evidence base for it, but it was there as a safety net. What a number of organisations have found is that this becomes rather too complex. And so what some organisations have chosen to do is to say, there's no red flags, but I'm still a bit worried about the patient. Because all the amber flags tell us to do, or the simplified amber flags box, is to get someone senior there to make a decision. So that's where we are. What do we do about sepsis? We've got international guidelines. There are 58 guidelines across 16 pages in critical care literature. Very few people will ever read them outside intensive care. They recognised this and they gave us 2 care bundles. And the top bundle was the originator bit behind the Sepsis 6. The bottom bundle was all the sexy stuff I was talking about with the central venous catheters and so forth. But we now have 3 international studies that say getting a sensible critical care professional to the patient is every bit as good as protocolised care. So what we're left with is what we've had in the UK since 2006, which is do the Sepsis 6, and if the patient doesn't get any better, then we call critical care. And that's what we've been doing for over a decade here. And it seems to be working, and multiple studies have found that it improves mortality by anything from around 20% to around 50%. And it's iterated over time. The only important thing about this slide is the variance box. Every Sepsis 6 pathway should have a variance box, because there will always be the patients in whom you just need more information. For antibiotics, is this just dehydration secondary to viral gastroenteritis? Is this another sepsis mimic like pancreatitis? Let's wait for the bloods. Let's not knee-jerk and give the antibiotics. Let's consider this carefully. If your pathways don't have a variance box, I would suggest you address this issue. It's not just hospitals. This is critically important. There's lots of sepsis champions around the country, and they're obsessed with getting their antibiotic delivery time down from 59 minutes to 57 minutes. It won't make a scrap of difference. It might make your figures look good, but it won't affect your outcome. Why? Because NCPOD identified for the first time a couple of years ago, sorry about the formatting, that sepsis is a community-acquired problem. More than 50% of people who had a discharge diagnosis of sepsis had it when they arrived, and 80% of people who had a discharge diagnosis of sepsis had their infection when they arrived. They then looked at what happened to these people before they got to hospital. Was it bad GPs not sending them in? Was it bad paramedics not transporting them to hospital? No, it was not asking for help. 60% of cases, patients didn't ask for help because they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what was wrong. And the delay in accessing healthcare, the modal delay, was 2 days. So we can't measure antibiotic delivery time in minutes if Jem and his mates are sitting at home for 2 days before they even think of accessing us. Our outcomes will not improve. We have to engage the public. We can't do it just by putting posters up. We can't fix our system just by making screensavers. We have to be prepared to invest. We have a great obsession with the airline industry in healthcare, and that's fine in the operating theatre, where you don't start the elective surgery if the checklist isn't right. But in a time-critical condition like sepsis, we might need to look to other industries. 1950, motor racing in North America. Even then, they had a performance guy, they had a safety guy, and they had a race official making sure everything was done correctly. What history tells us is that at about this point, this guy noticed that that guy had finished refueling the car. The pumps had got quicker. He then observed that they were now waiting for the guy who was changing the front right-hand wheel to wander around the other side of the car at his leisure and change the front left-hand wheel. So the refueling guy is now doing pointless things. He's helping the windscreen guy clean the windscreen. Look at that. And he's going to go on and give the driver a cup of tea and so forth. So the very next year, that guy made sure that they had 2 people changing the wheels, and they continued to shave seconds and seconds off their pit stop time. They continued to lead the championship, and they had another world record. This was 59 seconds. The very next year, they had a pit stop time of 47 seconds. Highly trained. Even then, they were doing crisis simulation, simulation training. Even then, just as in 2013, with a more modern Grand Prix race, we had task focus. The guys doing the jack didn't sometimes, and these are all men, by the way, I did check. The guys doing the jack didn't sometimes have a go at changing the wheels. The guys changing the wheels didn't sometimes have a go at waving the flag to tell the driver when to go or not. They were highly trained. They were highly resourced, of course. We now have 3 people on each wheel, not 1 person changing 2 wheels, but they're all earning over 100,000. They are experts, and they get that car out not in 59 seconds, but in 2.9 seconds. Now, I'm not saying that we need to give antibiotics in 2.9 seconds. I've already said that's pointless. What I am saying is that if we're going to achieve change from sepsis, we have to work together as teams. We have to dedicate personnel to it, just as in trauma, in heart attack, and in stroke, and this is going to take resource. The other thing is, someone told that Ferrari to come into the pit. It didn't circle round the track for 3 laps with the driver thinking, well, my tyres are a bit worn and my fuel tank's a bit low. Shall I go in? No, I don't want to bother them. And anyway, they'll only make me wait. So, we need to tell our cars when to come in. Otherwise, there's no point being absolutely brilliant at manning the jacks and changing wheels. We've got to educate our public. I'm afraid I have a slide of this man. I genuinely believe, head above parapet, this man takes sepsis seriously. I believe he is passionately committed to improving this, and that's irrespective of any other comments about him. Sequin. We will be finishing in about 2 minutes. Sequin. Everyone's been alarmed by the sequin. Well, a lot of people have been alarmed. It has driven better care. We have seen screening for sepsis increase to over 80% of opportunities nationally. We have seen early antibiotics increase within the first hour to over 90% in emergency departments and slightly lower in the wards. Well, that's scary. Surely that means we're giving a lot more antibiotics. We're not. We've front-loaded antibiotics. We've increased carbapenem and piptaz use in the emergency department. We've increased overall antibiotic use in the emergency department by nearly 1/5. But overall, piptaz and carbapenem use has gone down by 9% or thereabouts. Overall antibiotic consumption has gone up a fraction, but if you look at per capita, because our throughput of hospitals keeps going up and up and up, we're actually using fewer antibiotics per episode of care than we were before. So the sequin has not increased antibiotics. Educating the public. Unfortunately, there's no money in the public purse, so we as a small charity have had to fill this gap. So we're working with corporate partners to get the message out there. I'll talk about the message once I've shown you some pretty pictures. We've distributed posters with the help of Public Health England. We've distributed safety netting resources to people. We're working with ambulance services. The West Midlands is the first to have this messaging. Jeremy Hunt has said you no longer need the 111999. We're going to cycle that messaging with this over the next year. So ambulance service will be coming on board. We haven't got a big advertising budget, so we use what we can. There's loads of these out-of-hours doctors' cars in the country, and again, it's existing advertising space that we can use for the price of a sticker. We're making friends with JC Deco, who own all of the bus stops and the motorway signage and all that sort of thing. And we're saying to people, just ask, could it be sepsis? Most cost-effective advertising ever, this. This is BBC's Holby City. 5.1 million viewers per episode. For the price of 2 phone calls, 1 to a producer and 1 to the advertising executive, and a second-class postage of 2 posters, we had 12 episodes carrying these posters in full view of all the main characters in the background. We're asking people to ask, could this be sepsis? The call to action is twofold. One is if you've got an infection, you know what that feels like, but something doesn't feel right, you feel very much worse than usual, you just phone 111, make an appointment to see your GP and say, could this be sepsis? If you want to be more precise, you look for the safety netting. These are the adult ones, based on a Delphi approach across 200 survivors. We have children's safety netting instructions. And the second call to action is you go online or you find your card that you've been given years ago that's sitting at the bottom of a drawer somewhere. And if you've got one of those symptoms, you go straight to A&E. Because to Public Health England, that's a more important message than phone 999 because you'll get to A&E a lot quicker if you just drive yourself there. Not drive yourself, get driven there. Safety netting for children need a little bit more detail because children are very heterogeneous and vary in ages. So there's a wider resource that we're including in some of the child personal health records, the Red Book, which is agreed with all of the relevant Royal Colleges, agreed with Public Health England, and again empowers parents to go to A&E or phone 999 if their child has one of those symptoms. Last thing I want to say, you will be pleased to know, is that 4 weeks ago on Friday, we took a resolution to the World Health Assembly, which is a decision-making body for the World Health Organization. They adopted it. So that was the date of the recommendation of the Executive Board that they consider it. At the end of May, they adopted the resolution on sepsis. 10 action points for all 194 member states of the United Nations who are now mandated to develop national action plans on sepsis and to report on their implementation to the 73rd World Health Assembly in 3 years' time. Previous action plans, previous resolutions have included polio eradication, have included malaria control, have included HIV and AIDS. I cannot overestimate how important and significant this is for people with sepsis around the world today. Sepsis is here to stay. What are we going to do in the UK? Well, the first thing that you can do if you want to help is, you could come and give us your time and all that stuff, but most people don't have much time. If you want to help us to save lives as a small charity who's being charged by the government to do all of this for them, there's an opportunity. And it's the last day today. Lord Ashcroft, love him or loathe him, has agreed to give £1 to match every £1 given, up to a maximum of £250,000. And it's currently sitting at about £189,000. But if you want to do something, just search Just Giving, Urgent Appeal Sepsis, or search Just Giving Lord Ashcroft, make a quick donation. We would be enormously grateful. Because together, we're aiming, while we still have antibiotics, to save another 14,000 lives every year across the United Kingdom, which is saving more lives than if we stop bowel cancer killing anyone by next year. Thank you.